Karen's morning routine was sacred. Coffee at 6 a.m., neighborhood patrol at 6:30, violation documentation by 8 a.m. But this morning something was different. As she stepped onto her front porch with her clipboard and measuring tape, she noticed the silence. No lawn mowers, no leaf blowers, no sounds of suburban industry. Then she saw them. Every yard on Maple Street had sprouted overnight gardens of rebellion. Pink flamingos stood sentinel in the Johnsons' meticulously maintained lawn. The Patels had installed an inflatable unicorn that had to be 8 feet tall. Even quiet Mrs. Chen had placed a garden gnome army around her mailbox, each one painted in increasingly garish colors. But it was the sign in the Hendersons' front yard that made Karen's blood pressure spike. HOA-free zone, in letters large enough to be seen from space. Her phone rang. Karen? The voice belonged to Margaret Sinclair, but it carried an unfamiliar note of concern. You need to get down to the community center, now. The scene that greeted Karen defied every principle she'd fought to uphold. The pristine community center parking lot had been transformed into what could only be described as suburban anarchy. A massive inflatable slide occupied 3 parking spaces. Someone had set up a taco truck. Children were running everywhere, their parents actually encouraging them to play in the landscaped areas. What is this? Karen whispered, her clipboard trembling in her grip. This, announced Tom Henderson, approaching with a megaphone, is what happens when you declare war on your own neighborhood. Welcome to the first annual Maple Grove Rebellion Festival. Karen's eye began its familiar twitch. You can't do this. There are permits required for public gatherings, insurance liability issues, noise ordinances. Actually, Margaret Sinclair said, emerging from the crowd with a thick folder, we can. I've been reviewing the HOA bylaws, all 847 pages of them. Turns out there's a lot of interesting language in there about community engagement and resident rights. Karen snatched the folder, speed reading with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview was under attack. This doesn't. These provisions are for legitimate community activities, like celebrating our neighborhood diversity. Sandra Henderson suggested sweetly, gesturing to the growing festival around them. Like supporting local businesses, added Harold, nodding toward the taco truck that was doing surprisingly brisk business. Like creating opportunities for intergenerational community bonding, finished Margaret, pointing to where teenagers were helping elderly residents navigate the obstacle course someone had constructed from pool noodles and traffic cones. Karen felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything was wrong, chaotic, uncontrolled. And yet, as she looked around, she saw something that shouldn't exist in such circumstances. Her neighbors were happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way she hadn't seen in. When was the last time she'd seen people enjoy themselves in Maple Grove? The rules, she started, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. The rules, Margaret said gently, were meant to serve the community, not the other way around. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore was speechless. She stood in the center of organized chaos, watching her perfectly ordered world transform into something she didn't recognize. And the strangest part was the small voice in the back of her mind whispering that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely terrible. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Change of plans. Meet tonight. Same place. You'll understand soon. Karen stared at the message, then at the festival surrounding her. Something was building here. Something bigger than HOA violations and fence disputes. She could feel it in the way her neighbors looked at her, not with fear anymore, but with something almost like pity. Karen, Tom Henderson said, approaching cautiously, the election petition. We have enough signatures. The vote is tomorrow night. She nodded slowly, her mind already spinning toward her next move. Tomorrow night, then. As she walked back to her car, stepping carefully around a hopscotch game that had somehow expanded to cover half the parking lot, Karen realized that for the first time in her tenure as HOA president, she had no idea what would happen next. But perhaps most unsettling of all, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to stop it. The anonymous number texted again. The real rules aren't in any book, Karen, See you soon. This time, she didn't delete the message. The sound of splintering wood and twisted metal echoed through Maple Grove Estates at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, followed immediately by the unmistakable voice of Karen Whitmore screaming, "ILSHOBU wake ATHAPNs when you ignore the rules." Her silver BMW SUV sat wedged halfway through the Hendersons' pristine white picket fence, steam rising from the crumpled hood, like an offering to the gods of suburban warfare. Karen herself stood beside the wreckage, clipboard clutched in one manicured hand, HOA violation notices scattered around her like confetti at the world's most passive-aggressive parade. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the vehicle," Officer Martinez said, approaching cautiously. This was his third call to Maple Grove this month, all involving the same woman. Karen's reputation had spread through the entire police department like a particularly virulent strain of bureaucratic flu. "Don't you me?" Karen snapped, her perfectly styled blonde bob somehow still immaculate despite the chaos. "I am the duly elected president of this homeowners association, and I have been calling your department for weeks about the violations in this neighborhood. Weeks. And what do? Nothing." The Hendersons emerged from the house, Tom in his work clothes and Sandra still wearing her nursing scrubs from the night shift. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma peeked around her mother's legs, eyes wide at the destruction of her fairy garden that had been nestled beside the fence. "Are you insane?" Sandra shouted, her exhaustion giving way to pure rage. "You drove through our fence. Our daughter could have been playing there." Karen's eye twitched, the same towel that had preceded every major neighborhood incident for the past 2 years. "Your daughter," she said with the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes, "shouldn't be playing in an area that violates HOA guidelines regarding lawn ornamentation. Section 4.7 clearly states, 'Nobody cares about your stupid sections.'" Tom interrupted, gesturing at his demolished fence. "You're paying for this, Karen. Every last board." Officer Martinez pulled out his notepad with the weary resignation of a man who'd seen too much suburban drama. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to explain how your vehicle ended up in the Henderson property." Karen straightened her shoulders, transforming into what the neighborhood had dubbed her boardroom battle mode. It was a sight that had struck fear into the hearts of contractors, landscapers, and fellow residents for years. "I was conducting my weekly neighborhood compliance inspection," she began, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, "when I discovered that the Hendersons had not only failed to address the 17 violations I'd previously documented, but had actually added new infractions, including an unpermitted garden gnome and what appears to be a children's chalk art installation on their driveway." "You mean hopscotch?" Emma whispered. "Unlicensed recreational markings," Karen corrected without missing a beat. "I immediately contacted the authorities, as is my duty as HOA president. But when I called the non-emergency line, the dispatcher, her voice rose to a pitch that could shatter wine glasses, had the audacity to tell me that HOA violations were not a police matter." Officer Martinez nodded slowly. "Because they're not, Mrs. Whitmore. We've explained this before. So I called the fire department. They said the same thing. The mayor's office? Apparently too busy with actual municipal issues." Karen's air quotes were aggressive enough to constitute assault. "Even the county health inspector refused to come out here, claiming that a slightly overgrown hedge doesn't constitute a public health emergency." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered began to murmur. This was more entertainment than most had seen since the infamous Great Mailbox War of 2023, also orchestrated by Karen. "So you decided to drive through our fence instead?" Sandra asked, her voice climbing toward hysteria. Karen's composure cracked just slightly, revealing something desperate underneath. "I was trying to document the violations from multiple angles for my report. The steering wheel, the car seemed to have a mind of its own." Officer Martinez looked from the clearly deliberate tire tracks to Karen's flushed face. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you telling me this was an accident?" For a moment, Karen's mask slipped entirely. Her neighbors saw something they'd never witnessed before: uncertainty, fear, even. But then her jaw set with renewed determination. What I'm telling you, officer, is that this neighborhood has been operating in flagrant violation of legally binding HOA covenants for too long. If the proper authorities won't enforce the rules that keep our communities safe and property values stable, then perhaps it's time for more direct action. Karen stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. In her experience, anonymous supporters were usually more dangerous than open enemies. But as she pulled into her own perfectly maintained driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The emergency HOA meeting that evening drew the largest crowd in Maple Grove's history. The community center buzzed with an energy that hadn't been seen since the legendary holiday decoration controversy of 2022. Karen sat at the head table, her laptop open to a PowerPoint presentation titled Community Standards Enforcement, a multi-phase approach. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, clicking to her first slide, a photo of the Henderson fence, now sporting a Karen-shaped hole. "As you can see, today's incident was merely the natural consequence of systematic rule violations that have gone unchecked in our community." Harold Pembroke, the retired accountant from Elm Street, raised his hand. "Karen, you drove through their fence. That's not enforcement. That's destruction of property." "Harold," Karen replied with the patience of a kindergarten teacher explaining basic math, "I prefer to think of it as aggressive compliance auditing." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd, but it died quickly when they realized Karen wasn't joking. "Now, I've prepared a comprehensive plan to restore order to Maple Grove." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed map of the neighborhood with various properties marked in different colors. Red indicates critical violations requiring immediate intervention. Yellow represents moderate infractions with a 30-day compliance window. Green are our model residents who understand the importance of community standards. Tom Henderson stood up, his face still flushed with anger. "This is insane, Karen. You can't just declare war on the entire neighborhood because we don't trim our bushes to your exact specifications." Cat eye. Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "According to the HOA bylaws that every resident signed when they purchased their homes, I absolutely can. Section 12.3 grants the HOA president broad discretionary powers during community emergencies." "What emergency?" Sandra called out from the back of the room. Karen clicked to her next slide, a photograph of Mrs. Chen's garden, zoomed in on a single dandelion. "The systematic breakdown of property standards that threatens our community's economic stability and social cohesion. When rules become suggestions, chaos follows." The room erupted in arguments, neighbors turning on each other as years of suppressed grievances bubbled to the surface. Karen watched it all with the satisfaction of a conductor directing a particularly chaotic symphony. "Enough," boomed a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Margaret Sinclair, the 78-year-old retired federal judge who lived in the imposing colonial at the end of Maple Street. She walked with a cane but commanded respect like a general. "Karen, dear," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years settling disputes much more serious than fence violations. "You seem to have forgotten that HOA presidents are elected positions. They can also be unelected." Karen's confidence wavered for just a moment. "The next election isn't until." "Emergency elections can be called with a petition signed by 30% of residents," Margaret continued smoothly. "I believe we have about 40% of the neighborhood right here in this room." The crowd began to murmur with renewed energy, but Karen slammed her laptop shut with a sharp crack that silenced the room. "You want to remove me?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Fine. But understand this. I am the only thing standing between Maple Grove and complete anarchy. Without proper enforcement, this neighborhood will become a wasteland of overgrown lawns, unauthorized modifications, and," she paused dramatically, "rental properties." The collective gasp from the crowd told Karen she'd hit her mark. Property values were sacred in Maple Grove. "You have 48 hours, she announced, gathering her materials with theatrical precision. 48 hours to decide whether you want leadership or chaos, order or entropy. Choose wisely." As she swept from the room, Karen could hear the arguments resuming behind her, Neighbors turning on each other with the viciousness that only comes when property values are threatened. She smiled to herself as she walked to her car, carefully parked well within the designated lines. But as she drove home past the Henderson house, now sporting emergency plywood where their fence used to be, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: doubt. Not about the rules, never about the rules, but about whether her neighbors truly understood what she was trying to protect them from. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We saw what you did today. Impressive. We should talk." A concerned neighbor.